Hi everyone, welcome to our discussion panel where we're going to be talking about anti-heroes in fantasy. So let's begin by introducing the awesome authors that are joining us to this discussion. A few were unable to make it. We'll miss you, but let's go ahead and dive right on in with introductions.
Well, I'm Alan Batchelder, and I'm the author of the Immortal Treachery series, the first book of which is Steel, Blood, and Fire.
And my name is Tabi Slick. I'm the author of the Tompkin School Trilogy, paranormal dark fantasy for young adult readers about twins who are in Oklahoma and who are struggling with their inner demons. That have one desire, and that desire is to kill, which is not really your cookie cutter hero. So let's dive right on in on anti-heroes. But first, I think we need to define what a hero is. So what are some requirements that you think, Helen?
Well, I was sort of classically trained in this particular area. So in the literary sense, a hero is somebody who's larger than life, who's capable of great deeds, almost bordering on superhuman, but who might have some sort of a flaw or a weakness that could undermine them. And obvious examples would be Beowulf or Oedipus or Macbeth or people like that. And if you go forward, even into contemporary television, you see characters like Walter White or Ray Donovan or Dr. House or even Wolverine in the comics. These people who are tremendously able, super competent and super confident, and yet they have a weakness that makes them a tragic flaw, if you will, that makes them kind of sympathetic to the rest of us.
Oh, so for the anti-hero. For me, I think that is really true. Like your house and all of those, we've seen a big upsurge in the anti-heroes. But for me, to help me kind of think of an anti-hero, I kind of have to look at, oh, well, okay, what is a hero? What is your traditional cookie cutter anti-hero? And I think a hero is somebody that is driven by higher morals, usually. Sure. Yeah. Kind of your straightforward, they're on the right side of the law, and they do things for the greater good, despite, any human characteristics that they have. I think some examples of that would be, I don't know, I think of Dorothy from Wizard of Oz when I think of hero, kind of just doing things for the greater good, follows the rules, or like Hermione Granger from Harry Potter. That's your hero. And then you take that and take one of their characteristics and have the complete opposite of that, is kind of your anti-hero. They might not necessarily be on the right side of the law. They do things for the end justifies the means kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Right, yes. I think you don't want to go too far necessarily into, absolute villainy. I could look at someone like Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name. You were never really sure what side he was on. He tended to do good things, but then he'd turn around and do something atrocious,
Yeah, there is a fine line between the two, and sometimes your anti-heroes can almost seem like villains, almost.
Sure. You mentioned Harry Potter. I would say that he who shall not be named is a villain, but then Snape is an anti-hero in
Yes,
my view.
I would agree. I would agree with you there. I don't know. When I think of anti-hero, I also think of Sherlock Holmes. Like he doesn't, I mean, he seems to do things for the love of the mystery, not necessarily for, you know, just helping people.
Right.
That's another one of those kind of almost like House. I
Yes.
would say that it's
Yes.
really close.
Yeah, he's in it for the intellectual challenge, and any sort of humanitarian benefit is almost accidental.
Yeah, exactly. So why do you think we like these kinds of or do you like or do you dislike?
I do. I do. I think as you get older, and I'd love to see demographics for people who read my genre in particular. I think as you get older, you start to recognize that nobody is all good.
Right.
And very few people are all bad. And so I think that's part of the popularity of Game of Thrones, is that even somebody like Jaime Lannister, who's had an ongoing affair and children with his own sister, you can see he's struggling with this desire to do good things too, you know.
Right.
She's really the only outright villain, I suppose, and even she has this motherly compulsion. So why do I think people like it? Because they see something of the world around them in these stories, and maybe even something of themselves. You know, we all have this struggle where we want to be good people, but at the same time, we occasionally just want to punch someone in the face, you know? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the relatable effect. Like if you have somebody that's just super perfect, I mean, it's idealistic, and you know, we should always strive to be better, but sometimes we want to see the ordinary hero. We want to see the ones that aren't necessarily perfect save the day.
Even Tolkien has Bilbo eventually start to succumb to the ring, and he has this struggle. Mm-hmm. Whereas, you know, there are times when it's hard to accept Frodo because he's just so incredibly goody-goody, you know, and you feel that attraction towards the darkness occasionally.
Right. That kind of struggle between good and evil sometimes lies somewhere in the middle. Sometimes people land there.
Yes.
Yeah. So, quick question about your book. What is the age group?
So I teach middle school, so I have kind of a restraint upon me not to write anything so disturbing if they ever get their hands on it. But I've said 17 and up. But it's certainly not beyond the means of an avid reader in middle school. I would like to be able to write unfettered to a more adult audience, but I haven't had any, you know, critiques in reviews about the age appropriateness of it. I think it's right up there with the other books that I mentioned.
Yeah.
What about you?
It's kind of the same level, I think. My book is in the young adult section. Some people have said that, oh, well, it definitely needs to be 16 and up. But I think that if a reader is, you know, just drinking up all of these books like Macbeth and all of those, mine in some areas might seem rather tame. I try to mix in a lot of just your everyday, your normal, everything's, you know, normal, and kind of stuff that teenagers might be going through anyways.
Sure. And that's that's a great market. I mean, the shelves of the library at my school are all young adult stuff for days.
Yeah.
The most mature book in there is the Sherman Alexie book about the part-time Indian. I always get the title wrong. The Mostly True or Partly True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Anyway, it's a pretty mature book, even though it's an easy read. So, yeah, you're in a perfect niche.
Yeah. It seems like in recent years, I've just been noticing a lot more of these anti-heroes, and I never really thought about that, that term when I began, writing this trilogy, like what, 7 years ago. I was a slow writer, but I never really thought about that term, and now I'm seeing it everywhere. Why do you think that is, this kind of upsurge?
I think the world is a kind of a dark place right now. With various wars going on, and look at all the devastation from hurricanes and earthquakes and potential issues with North Korea. And while I think people want escapism, they want escapism that they can buy into and believe. And so heroes whose only issue is fighting some nebulous dark force are not as compelling, as we said before, as heroes who are maybe a little ambivalent or maybe a little confused about exactly what they should be doing and whose side they should take.
Yeah.
And it's a more complex, it's kind of the difference between eating a snickerdoodle, which is a perfectly great, treat by itself, and eating tiramisu. One is much more complex and
right.
and satisfying for the adult palate. And for the kids, it's just sweet, sweet and more sweet.
Yeah. And I think right along, like, your not just for adults, but for teenagers also, from I don't know, 13 up, like, all of that starts to slowly but surely change, and you're starting to see things in a new way, and each phase of adulthood, you're starting to see more and more complexity in the world, and you can't relate to something that's just basic, like your snickerdoodle.
Right. Well, also, there's countless studies about stages of brain development, and in early teens, kids are in a place where everything is a dichotomy. It's black or it's white, and as they get older, they see more nuanced shades of meaning and possibility, and more complexity.
So, talking about like anti-heroes in genres for that age group, people have put Harry Potter as an anti-hero. They've put, which is interesting to think about. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I would definitely put Snape in. As I said, I'm not as sold on Harry Potter himself.
Yeah.
Because I don't see him doing anything overtly selfish or cruel. There are certainly other characters in there. I don't know the series as well as many of my students do, who read each book 5 times, but maybe Sirius Black or one or two of the other characters. In terms of more adult, in my genre, grimdark, I mean, Joe Abercrombie has some great characters. One is called the Bloody Nine, and he's just a savage brute. But occasionally he has moments where he's trying to do the right thing, not necessarily because he wants to do the right thing, but because it's the lesser of two evils in a way.
Right. And, sometimes those are the options that we get.
Well,
in real
some
life.
would argue that's what we had in our last presidential election. We had a choice between, I'm not necessarily in that boat, but I certainly heard a lot of that in my community, that the two choices were not necessarily good choices.
Yeah, well, just I mean, if you go to, lunch and you have two options, you have pizza or hamburgers, but you don't have any other options. Well, which one do you pick?
Right, right.
Lesser of two evils.
Or you create your own,
Yeah.
which is, I'm doing a blog post on, the writers who played D&D. So many fantasy writers played Dungeons and Dragons, and I think that, Sherman Alexie did, and Ray Feist did, and Joe Abercrombie has, and even Stephen Colbert and Vin Diesel are, big Dungeons and Dragons players at one point. And so I think there are times when you say, the heck with this, I'm going to create my own world, I'm going to build my own universe.
Yeah. And for that, that's kind of used to not just escape, your own personal life, but it's a way to work through some of the things that you might also face too. Some of that stuff might slip in. I know that it slipped in some of mine, and I've seen it in other books too.
Yeah, it's a little cathartic, the chances to sort of work out your own. We mentioned this earlier, your own inner demons, in the story. Maybe in life you can't punch that bully in the nose, but in your novel, you can create a character and punch him in the nose, an infinite number of times.
Yeah, maybe too much is too much, but
well, so in my genre, we push that boundary. We're like, okay, what is too much? How far is the line? And I'm always astounded by people who, they'll write on Amazon, they'll read a book about a serial killer like The Fourth Monkey, and they'll criticize it and say, oh, this was too gory. It was a book about a serial killer. What were you expecting?
Yeah. So I'm not quite familiar with grimdark. Grimdark is the genre that you write in.
Yes.
As far as other books in that genre, does it seem to be saturated with a lot of anti-heroes, or?
Oh yeah. That is, I would say it's a key factor. Stephen Erickson, who wrote the Malazan Book of the Fallen, credited Glenn Cook with creating kind of a style that's a cross between Lord of the Rings and Vietnam, and that is to say that it's Lord of the Rings, but it's extremely gritty, and characters have sex, and they curse a lot, and they slice each other in half, and it's very it's no holds barred, no punches pulled type of writing, and kind of like Apocalypse Now, it's just right in your face, and some people get tired of that and they want to go over to a different genre, but this is just my first big foray into it. And I'm thinking that my second book will be a steampunk and my third will be a horror novel. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, cool. Yeah, I got some feedback because mine is in the paranormal dark fantasy genre, and I got feedback that it's not really saturated with a lot of anti-heroes, and that's probably why I was surprised. I'm like, you know what? They are they are when I came to actually think about it, because
Well, I was kind of thinking of one. A surprising example would be Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
You think he's the villain, but then there's that moment at the end when he's kind of been stalking the psychiatrist, and he's talking to Clarice Starling on the phone, and he says, I'm having an old friend for dinner, and the audience goes wild because they know that Hannibal Lecter is going to eat the psychiatrist. And the author's done this weird bit of jujitsu where we're actually rooting for the bad guy, right?
Yeah. And it's really fascinating to see that kind of artistry
Yeah.
come out in writing, where you're rooting for a villain or
Yeah, well,
things
Shakespeare
like that.
does that in Richard III too. You know, you want to see how much carnage this person, you know, how many lives he can ruin, how much destruction he can wreak.
Yeah. Why is that entertaining? Like, why is it
Because
caution?
we have to be good. You know, in our society, we have to be good, and being
Yeah, that's
good
true.
is exhausting.
That's true. If you're going to be good, if you're going to be good at anything, you need to go all the way. You need to commit to
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Huh. Wow.
You know, and it's almost like in our society, you're not entitled to have a bad day or be in a bad mood or, you know, uh, be Ebenezer Scrooge before his conversion. You know, we're expected to be Ebenezer Scrooge after his conversion, where we're happy and we're helpful and we're thoughtful and we're, you know, sincere. And you just want to be a curmudgeon sometimes and be rude and abrasive and
Yeah. Be the Grinch.
yes, exactly. Yeah, who doesn't love the Grinch?
Yeah. I mean,
The
he's
Grinch
a
is an anti-hero.
he is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there really now in that example, and I know there are others, but I can't think of them right now. But like, can you think of any that are where we have an anti-hero, but we don't necessarily have a villain, or we have many anti-heroes, and some are a little bit more anti-heroic than others?
Well, I'd like to talk with experts about this because I sort of think Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities. I don't know how familiar you are with the story, but Sidney Carton is this just wasted drunk, you know, of a lawyer. He's just wasted his life. He's a loser, and at the very end he does like the most noble thing in the history of the world at the very end of the novel. And so I think these characters exist throughout our literature, but they just maybe haven't gotten quite as much attention as we're giving them today. And maybe it's the anti-hero's day in the sun,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. And the theory is right now that this kind of, they're in the highlight right now because of the dark times that we're living through right now and all of this struggle. Do you think that technology and social media has influenced this kind of
Yeah, I was
anti-heroic?
thinking about that earlier when we were talking about teenagers, because they, courtesy of the internet, can now see the most atrocious, horrible things that you and I never, I mean, I'm considerably older than you are, but you and I never saw when we were growing up. I can watch people die. I can watch pornography. And kids have access to that. You know, I can watch executions. I can look at horrible flesh-eating diseases. And that stuff never was anywhere near me when I was a kid.
Right. Yeah, I think the same for me. I remember getting our computer at, maybe I was 9. No, I was younger than that. But we didn't have internet. We used it for typing tutor. I used it only for typing tutor, and that
Nameless
was
Beacon?
yeah, yeah. So when I got to typing class, like that was, you know, that was my
Yeah.
jam. That was my video game growing up.
Well, and it's really Pandora's box now. And
Yeah.
without an adult presence around, you know, kids can get just sucked into that, drawn into that dark, frightening energy and be horribly scarred. I mean, if you want to have a scary Halloween, see where the internet will take you. You know?
Right. Just follow that rabbit trail.
Yeah.
And you said that you bring like a little bit of humor into your
Yes.
books. And I think that that's really important, particularly if somebody who isn't quite used to all of that, or really any of us needs
Right.
that too.
Right. I remember finishing The Road, you know, the Cormac McCarthy novel, and it's just so bleak. You know, it has a tiny bit of hope at the very end, but the whole novel is just such, it's like being pushed through a meat grinder, you know. And I want
Yeah.
people to read my second book and my third book and my fourth book. I don't want them to walk away going, I'm not going anywhere near that again.
Right. I think anti-heroes, they do have their darkness in them, just like all of us do. But I think with the right balance, the beauty of them is that they do have that glimpse of hope, or they do sometimes do things for the right reasons, just like any of us. But having those humorous moments, you know, kind of makes it a little bit of an easier read, I think, than just the doom.
Well, that's
and
my
gloom.
hope. But I would probably do that anyway. I mean, I don't necessarily do it by design. I'm just an inherently goofy person. You know?
But you know, kind of interesting, because you know, I think a stereotype of somebody who writes in, you know, darker, kind of darker stories, you might think, oh, they must be
Disturbed.
really, yeah, disturbed.
Yeah.
Not have a sense of humor, never smiles, like. But I don't know. Have you thought about that at all, or?
Well, I think I mentioned I'm a classically trained actor, and so I've come to a point where I really enjoy all of my emotions. I mean, I don't enjoy terror and anxiety and for great periods of time, but I give them their due. You know, I experience those things, I examine them a little bit, I let myself feel them, and I'm not running from anything. I'm not trying to hide, but I also do have a brighter side. Um, you know, did I have a terrible childhood? Uh, I went through some hard times, but no, I mean, not worse than somebody growing up in Somalia, maybe. So um, I've always just had an attraction for the dark. And when I was a little boy, you know, people had imaginary friends. I used to pretend I was a werewolf all the time, you know, so that I would never have bad dreams, because I was already a monster. And so therefore, you know, what kind of nightmares does a monster have?
Right, right. And you know what? That's kind of, that might be
It's kid logic.
well, and that's a question too. Like, what kind of nightmares do monsters have? And you know, that's kind of an interesting question.
Maybe somebody will, you know, write a book about it, or make a movie or something.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, we do know. I mean, we know from Frankenstein, right? I mean, the
Right.
original Frankenstein, that he has all kinds of nightmares of loneliness and the freakishness of himself and his experience, and that's why he wants the bride, so he doesn't have to experience that by himself.
Right. So, what do you think are some stereotypes of anti-heroes?
Wow, that's a challenging one. I think it, like we said earlier, it requires a certain degree of nuance, or you lapse into just extreme villainy. You're just an outright villain.
Right.
And so as I'm thinking through books and movies and things, I see when they become stereotypical, they become villains. Do you have one in mind that you could think of?
Well, I'm thinking of all the anti-heroes we've already kind of mentioned, kind of House, Sherlock, these types of characters. Some even say that Scarlett O'Hara was also an anti-hero. That's kind of delving outside of fantasy, but I would think, you know, sarcastic comes to mind. I mean, when you think of an anti-hero, you think of
Sure. Yeah.
sarcastic. What
I was going to say you don't get that a lot. I don't know if you've watched Ray Donovan, but he's a definite anti-hero, and he does not engage in sarcasm. But House definitely does. I'm wondering about Walter White, you know, in Breaking Bad.
Oh yeah, Breaking Bad.
People who have that. Snape is definitely sarcastic.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that's why I've always liked him. But you know,
right? Yeah. Well, there is an argument that people who are sarcastic are a bit more intelligent, but I don't know if I subscribe to that or not. But it's certainly interesting, and it makes you wonder what the sarcasm is. Is it armor? Are you protecting yourself? Are you? And I mean, in Snape's case, he ends up having a very soft heart ultimately for one
right.
person in particular. So, is the sarcasm some sort of a shield or a mask behind which the real person exists?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Um,
I guess
I
in
think
my genre, they're more bloodthirsty too. I mean, anti-heroes are just engines of destruction, like Ray Donovan. They're engines of just or Clint Eastwood and any of his westerns. Just when you get on their bad side, all bets are off. You're done. They're going to destroy you and lay waste to the landscape.
right. And do you think that that is um, that drive is kind of because of their, I mean, strong like moral compass, like their own internal moral compass, that if you've done this, that's their number one golden rule, and now you're just on the bad list forever.
Yeah, yeah. I think where you and I might have a moral compass that talks about what's right for society, theirs is very much individual. You know, like I have, I know I have a red line, and if you cross it, that's it. I'm going to destroy you. And it's not so much related to anyone else. I don't care if you burn down my neighbor's house or you flood the neighbor on the other side, but if you hurt me and mine, I'm going to come after you. So,
Right. Almost sounds like, you know, a mother
Godfather.
bear, like, oh, I'm gonna go
Oh yeah,
go fight after you.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
these are my people, and you
Yeah,
know.
I think that's part of it. You hit on something. There's a real animalistic uh, aspect to it that we can kind of relate to. You know, like when you strip away all of our humanity, what's left when you've challenged me or my spouse or my children or what I believe in?
Right. And I know that there are, not just talking about your complete heroes, but talking about your complete villains. There are, I've read some that are, you know, well, the villain is just bad. And you can do that, and it's, sometimes it doesn't distract from the story. But I think if you strip everything away, it's not just, they're just all bad. There's some sort of rule that they're following.
Right. Well, if you're acting them, I've always been taught that, you know, if you have to play Hitler in a movie, you can't play him as a villain because Hitler didn't necessarily hate himself. You know,
Right.
he wasn't necessarily full of self-loathing, or um, Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't necessarily full of. We take these villains in the real world. Stalin wasn't necessarily full of self-loathing, so they don't come on twirling their mustaches, rubbing their hands, going "Mwah, ha ha ha
I'm
ha."
going to, yeah.
They their evil is of a different nature, but they might have spouses, they might have children, they might have things or people that they love. It's just that the total outcome of their behavior is completely inexcusable and unacceptable in the world.
Right. I, and I think having villains that are relatable, like as not completely relatable, but like more human, not just complete, they're just mwahaha, they're just bad, makes them more scary. I think a little bit more terrifying
When you can't understand their
Well, I think the scarier part is when you don't just play Hitler as a villain, you play Hitler as, you know, a human. Because,
well, yeah, the Green River Killer was a father with children. And he would go home every day to his wife and children and be a dad, you know. And then
right.
at night he would go kill 57, you know, or however many women. That's the really creepy part.
Yeah, that's where that's more terrifying than just, you know, they're just completely bad. When you make them more human, that's when they become a little terrifying. But I digress there.
No, I mean, it's part of the overall conversation because the anti-hero is somewhere between the hero and the villain.
Yeah. That's why when I first heard the term, which I haven't heard it for a very long time, it's just kind of something that has crept in, and I'm thinking about it like, what is this difference? And now I'm seeing it in, you know, more characters. Like, they're not completely good or they're not completely bad. And I think that blur, though, it makes it difficult sometimes to distinguish the two. What would you say is your personal definition of, like, okay, well, this is when the anti-hero delves into the villain aspect of things, or vice versa?
For me, there's always a descent into darkness, and the question is, can they climb back out again? You know, and it might be a necessary descent into darkness. I'm thinking of the Clint Eastwood movie Forgiven, where we meet him at the beginning of the movie, and he's a reformed gunslinger. He's a reformed bad guy, and he gets enlisted to go save this town, kind of against his will, but then he slides back into darkness and he just becomes a killing machine. The end result of which is a net good, even though it makes him a horrible human being for a brief period of time. So I'm always most interested in watching them slide into that and wondering, can they halt the slide, or will this be a permanent transition? Have they completely gone to the dark side, you know? I wish I'd seen a little more of that in Anakin Skywalker, you know, the struggle with the temptation to go over to the dark side. I just always felt in those movies his transition from, you know, goody Jedi to Sith was like quicker and a little less explicable, because he murders an entire school full of children at one point, and then at the end of the series we see Anakin Skywalker's, you know, ghostly spirit happy at the whole end of the Star Wars series.
Oh,
You know what I'm talking
yeah.
about?
No, unfortunately, I haven't watched those, but that does seem a little bit too quick.
Yeah, it is, and I think it was justly criticized by a lot of people. So I don't know if I answered your question, but to me that's the fascinating part. When they start to slide into darkness, can they arrest the slide and rescue themselves? And some do, and some are lost.
Right. So I'm guessing that your tipping point is if they go to a point in which they can't return, and this has just become a permanent thing, then that would be the point that they're a villain.
Yes.
But if they're at whatever point they are, that they can go back to the light, pull themselves back out, or maybe somebody else pulls them back out, and then
Right.
that's your anti-hero equilibrium.
Well, that's kind of part of our mythos too, even in the Bible. I'm not an especially religious person, but the story of the prodigal son, you know, where he goes off and parties up a storm and wastes all his fortune, and he comes back home and the dad celebrates because he had fallen off the deep end, but he'd managed to come back. And so they have a huge celebration. And in some ways, that's what makes the character's journey more satisfying. And we can talk about the journey too, because they have to have trials and tribulations. They have to have moments where everything they believe in or value is in doubt. Otherwise, it's vanilla from beginning to end.
Right. I mean, you think of House and pull out all the, you know, all of his darkness, and you redo the show, and then you've kind of lost your show, and you've lost the journey that he goes through. And I think the same goes for like the originals. I don't know if you've watched the originals.
Not yet, no.
I'm a fan. But there are many characters in there that
What about the guy in Mad Men? Did you ever watch that?
Mad Men?
The advertising thing? I think the central character in that might have been. Anyway, but yeah, there are a lot of contemporary examples of the things we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is good for us, you know.
Right?
We can write about it and explore it. But the question is, would you want to be married to Dr. House?
Oh, dear.
No.
I would love to watch from afar.
It's the same way you go to the zoo and you go, what a pretty lion. I wouldn't like to own him or have him in my house, but the lion's great to look at up close to bars.
It's like a kangaroo, too. I mean, they're beautiful creatures. It's cool to see them jump. Would not want to meet them.
Right.
Ever. But
so kangaroos are grimdark, huh? No, they're anti-heroes.
I think kangaroos
is the kangaroo an anti-hero?
That is to be determined.
Yes.
And the next person that
can write that novel.
Right. All right. Well, I think we've explored thoroughly this.
Yes.
The concept of anti-heroes, and that they're in the middle of your
They're
good.
fascinating.
Yes, we
They're
love them.
Predictable.
And they can be relatable. They can be relatable. And I don't know about you. I want to see more of them.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Bring them on.
And they're imperfect, which I love. Right.
Just like all of us.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alan, for joining us. And could we see that cover of your book one more time?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Steel,
Blood, and Fire.
Steel, Blood, and Fire. All right. Well, it was great that you were able to join us in this discussion. And I would also like to give a big thanks to the creators of Virtual FantasyCon.
Me too.
For putting this on. It's a great opportunity, and I can't wait to see what all the authors bring.
Yeah, and I hope there will be comments. Like if we post this on there, there'll be comments beneath, because I'd love to get feedback and thoughts from other people.
Yeah. Like, what are your opinions on, anti-heroes and all the things that we've talked about?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Bye.
I'm going to sign off. Have a good day.